Terrorism isn't what it used to be, and terrorists aren't who we may have imagined. Hi, I'm Robbyn Taylor, and I'd like to share some thoughts with you about mass-mediated terrorism and what that means when it comes to a type of power given to terrorist organizations and leaders. I'm a doctoral student studying communication, and as a journalist, this particular topic is very interesting to me. If you're watching this video, some of the things I talk about will be very familiar to you, but others, not so much. I'll try to keep points simple so that even the unfamiliar cases and concepts I discuss will help you make sense of what mass-mediated terrorism is and what it means to you as a consumer of media. In this day, many people have a clear idea of what constitutes terrorism, but I'd just like to offer some guidelines for this video. The U.S. Department of State adopted terminology that's similar to the official U.S. government's definition. Terrorism is premeditated and politically motivated. Targets are civilians, and the violence is carried out by people who aren't representatives of any government. Put the idea of terrorism together with mass media, any technology or communication that gets messages to a wide audience, and the notion of mass-mediated terrorism isn't such a foreign concept. It's terrorism happening while the world watches. No longer are terrorists thought of simply as suicide bombers. Terrorism has become much more of a spectacle than that, as evidenced by the world watching as the Twin Towers were reduced to rubble on live TV on September 11, 2001. Regent University is a journalist and author, and she's thought of as an expert in the field of mediated terrorism. In her book, Mass-Mediated Terrorism, Mainstream and Digital Media in Terrorism and Counterterrorism, University pinpoints 4 goals terrorists can achieve when their actions and words are publicized. First, University points out that terrorists want public attention to create intimidation. Think back to September 11. The visual devastation was so spectacular that just the possibility of more acts created a sense of gripping fear. Next, University believes that terrorists need publicity to have their demands and grievances known. This could be illustrated by the release of video to media that showed ISIS members beheading Americans. Once they had the attention of the public, ISIS began telling Americans and others who may have been their victims why we were targets. Through public recognition, NATO says that terrorists are aiming for respect and sympathy. During the 1985 hijacking of TWA Flight 847, Nabi Berry was a spokesperson for the terrorists. Regent University communication professor and researcher Dr. William Brown wrote about Berry and his persuasive communication during that situation. Brown's article, The Persuasive Appeal of Mediated Terrorism, the Case of TWA Flight 847 Hijacking, was published in the spring 1990 Western Journal of Speech Communication. Brown's study suggests that Berry was able to speak through the news media and persuade Americans that a solution to the hostage crisis was to release Shiite prisoners, who he said were civilians with families, just as the American hostages were. Finally, University relays that terrorists need publicity to create a legitimacy for their groups. Being recognized by other governments and leaders gives them power. Now that I've talked about what mediated terrorism is and how terrorists can achieve their goals through media, let's look at how that happens. First, you've got the obvious. When there's death and destruction, it gains media attention. Now, the media might see coverage as public safety issues or informing audiences about world events, but it does give those opportunities for terrorists to legitimize their groups and make demands known. Next, there's an idea called the triangle of political communication, which NACO subscribes to. Think of a triangle where the corners are made up of the public, the media, and those with political power. The corner of the triangle that represents the media allows for communication to flow between the government and public in a mediated fashion. Terrorists can use the media as an entry point into that triangle. So this idea of a triangle of political communication gives terrorists a way to have the public see their messages and possibly achieve their intimidation and legitimacy goals. However, if used to their advantage, it also gives terrorists an entry to begin working on developing a sympathy for their cause. In Brown's research I mentioned earlier, he looks at how narrative theory provides a way to see how terrorists can frame messages so people are more receptive. Narrative theory might sound complicated, but it's just a communication theory conceptualized by scholar Walter Fisher that claims people retain information and make sense of messages through storytelling. It rests on concepts that a story makes sense to an audience and it's believable. In Brown's TWA study, he shows Berry was an effective storyteller who presented a believable narrative that made sense to American people. He recognized his audience, and Berry targeted the American people trying to align himself with them. He wasn't afraid to talk to the media, so Berry found a platform for his narrative fairly easy. As you can see, terrorism has shifted in the past several decades into something new, and communication technology plays a large part in disseminating messages from terrorists, whether it's to make us fearful and take away our feelings of security and freedom, or even to provoke sympathetic feelings for recruitment purposes. There's much more to this idea and these concepts, but even just this quick look shows that media viewers can't be complacent when it comes to mediated terrorism.